Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute clinical precision.
Right. It's very exact.
Yeah, exactly. It is almost like engineering in a way. Like
Yeah.
you fall off a bike, you break your arm, and they put you in an X-ray machine.
Hmm.
And that glowing image just shows a jagged white line across the bone, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
It is entirely binary, really. I mean, the bone is broken or the bone is intact.
Yep.
The mechanism of injury is usually straightforward. Force met resistance and, well, force won.
Exactly. And there is something deeply comforting about that. Even when you're in a ton of pain, we just love things that are visible.
Oh, absolutely.
We love things that can be neatly categorized and immediately understood. But then, you step out of the hospital and into the world of human behavior, sociology, and historical trauma.
And it gets messy.
So messy. Suddenly, that pristine X-ray machine is completely useless. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky, constantly shifting, and honestly deeply uncomfortable to look at.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
Because when you are diagnosing societal behavior, you aren't looking at a single point of impact like a broken bone.
Right.
You are looking at centuries of overlapping systems, hidden incentives, and deeply ingrained fears that span generations.
And that is exactly where we are heading today. So welcome to this deep dive. I want to be upfront with you right out of the gate. Today's exploration covers some incredibly heavy, dark terrain.
It really does.
We are looking at the historical evolution of prejudice against Jewish people, but I want to make a promise to you. This is not just going to be a catalog of centuries of historical injustices.
Right, we're not just reading a timeline here.
Exactly. We aren't just reciting dates and events. We are treating this as a profound, meticulously detailed diagnostic manual for human behavior. Our mission today is to untangle the roots of how societies actually construct the outsider over time.
That is the crucial framing, I think. We are looking at the machinery itself.
The machinery, yeah.
Because prejudice is rarely just a spontaneous, inexplicable feeling of hatred that erupts out of nowhere. It is an engineered machine.
Wow, engineered. That's a strong word for it.
But it fits. It is built on administrative systems, economic fears, political incentives, and highly crafted narratives that allow these destructive patterns to repeat themselves in entirely different soils, across entirely different eras of human history.
So as we walk through this stack of source material today, I want you to keep a mental checklist. Listen to how these historical mechanisms operate, and ask yourself how they might mirror the information cycles, the narratives, and, well, the blame games you see popping up in your own modern social media feeds.
Because the technology changes, but the human psychological wiring really doesn't.
It really doesn't. And to help us visualize this immense span of time, let's imagine the space behind us just transforming.
I like that.
Picture a shifting, abstract timeline of human history stretching back thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
We might see the marble columns of ancient Rome fade into the cobblestones of a medieval marketplace, and then shift into the brutalist concrete of 20th century Europe.
And we are going to watch this machinery of prejudice adapt to every single one of those environments.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we jump into that timeline and look at the historical events themselves, we first need to understand the blueprint. How does bias actually operate structurally?
Right, because there is an anatomy to an accusation.
Yeah. If you strip away the specifics of any given century, you find three core recurring layers. The sources lay these out as the narrative layer, the system layer, and the justification layer.
Those three layers are really where the diagnostic analysis happens.
Yep.
So let's start with the narrative layer. Simply put, this is how a group of people is framed in the public imagination. Throughout history, Jewish communities were almost universally framed as a group that was simultaneously inside society.
Like living in the towns, participating in the economy.
Exactly, but yet fundamentally outside of it. And that inherent tension made them incredibly vulnerable to myth-making.
So the narrative is basically the story we tell ourselves.
Yes. The narrative acts as the meaning maker. It is the story that a society tells itself, saying, this group is dangerous, or this group is fundamentally different from us.
And those stories aren't just dry text, right? They are designed to press very specific, visceral, emotional buttons.
Oh, highly emotional.
They trigger fear, disgust, economic envy, and moral panic. They hit the most primal parts of the human brain.
Exactly. The stories act as cultural containers for social anxiety. When a society is stressed, the narrative provides a face for that stress.
Right.
But a story alone isn't enough to sustain centuries of marginalization. That requires the second component, the system layer.
And this is how the narrative gets locked in, isn't it?
Exactly. This is how it gets normalized and locked into physical reality. Bias only becomes durable, multi-generational architecture when it is embedded in laws, institutions, and daily economic incentives.
So we are talking about like legal segregation, special taxation, being excluded from owning land.
Or being barred from certain professions, yeah.
Yeah.
The system forcefully restricts the group, physically making them visibly different or disadvantaged.
Which naturally brings us to the third layer, the justification layer. And this is the respectable framework used to excuse the brutality of the system.
Right.
It is where prejudice puts on a suit and tie or, I don't know, a priest's robe and dresses itself up as objective truth.
The justification layer is fascinating because it is the chameleon of the three. Depending on the era, the justification might be religious doctrine, claiming that God demands this separation.
Right.
Later on, it might be cultural superiority. And even later, it might adopt the language of pseudoscience and biology.
So it changes its clothes to match whatever society respects most at the time.
Precisely. The justification exists to explain to the average, everyday citizen why the cruel system they're looking at is actually completely fair, natural, and deserved.
Now, here is the part that really stopped me in my tracks when I was researching this material. These three layers, narrative, system, justification, they don't just sit next to each other.
No, they interact.
Yeah, they create a terrifying, self-sustaining feedback loop. It's like a sociological immune system malfunctioning. Instead of attacking a real virus, the society attacks a harmless element, and then the body creates antibodies, laws, and systems to permanently isolate it.
That's a really good way to visualize it.
Like a crisis happens, say a famine or an economic crash, that creates massive societal instability. The narrative immediately assigns blame for that crisis to a visible other.
Right.
The system then reinforces the separation of that other. The justification makes the majority feel morally righteous about doing it. And this is the darkest part. The miserable outcomes created by the system are fed back into the narrative as definitive proof that the group deserved it all along.
It is a massive, incredibly destructive cycle of false cause and effect.
But wait, let me ask you this. Does the narrative always come before the system? Or do systems sometimes accidentally create the narrative?
What's fascinating here is that the circular reasoning makes it hard to pull apart. You see this repeatedly in the historical record. A ruling class will establish a system that first produces a tangible difference.
Like forcing them to live in a certain area.
Right, and then society will blame the marginalized group for exhibiting that exact difference.
Unbelievable.
For example, a medieval city legally forces a group into a walled, segregated neighborhood. They are literally locked in at night.
Yeah.
A generation or two later, the wider society looks at that enclave and says, look at them, they refuse to integrate with us. They are so clannish. They must inherently want to be separate.
That circular reasoning is just maddening. It's like society manufactures the evidence to convict you of a crime they already decided you were guilty of.
Exactly. It's an epistemic trap.
And that loop is precisely the mechanism that allowed anti-Semitism to survive massive paradigm shifts in human history. The target of the prejudice persists even as the language of the justification completely morphs to fit the times.
Right. Society creates the condition, but then misreads that historical circumstance as the biological, moral, or cultural destiny of the group.
So let's fire up this timeline and see this machinery actually being built and upgraded over the centuries. I want to start way back in the ancient period.
Okay, let's go back.
We're talking roughly 1000 BCE to about 300 CE. We are looking at the Israelites and Judeans living under massive world-conquering empires like the Neo-Babylonians, the Greeks, and eventually the Roman Empire.
Right.
Now, when you look at the prejudice in this era, it wasn't racial, it wasn't about bloodlines, it was intensely political and religious.
To understand the ancient era, we have to look at the material and geopolitical triggers. Judea wasn't just some quiet, out-of-the-way province.
No, it was right in the middle of everything.
Exactly. It was a major geopolitical hotspot. It was the land bridge connecting Egypt, Europe, and Asia. Empires constantly wanted to control it.
Right.
And you had massive Jewish revolts against these occupying empires, most notably the First Jewish-Roman War, which culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
Right. But the perceived threat to these ancient empires wasn't a biological fear, like we see later on. It was a crisis of authority.
Exactly. The core friction was monotheism existing within a highly aggressive polytheistic imperial world.
Because the Romans had like dozens of gods.
Hundreds, really. In the ancient world, when one empire conquered another, The standard practice was syncretism. I conquer your city, which means my god defeated your god, so your god now joins my pantheon.
Right, it's like a theological merger and acquisition.
Exactly. It was a way of politically assimilating conquered peoples.
Because in those empires, religion and state loyalty were the exact same thing. The emperor wasn't just a political leader. I mean, in Rome, he was literally considered divine.
Precisely. So when the Israelites and later the Judeans absolutely refused to assimilate their theology.
When they said, no, there is only one God, we will not bow to the emperor's statue.
Right, will not sacrifice to Jupiter. The Romans didn't view this merely as a quirky theological disagreement.
No, they took it personally.
To the Roman administrative mind, the logic was, they reject our gods, therefore they fundamentally reject our political authority. Real material political conflict over land and taxation was interpreted as a stubborn, inherent cultural defiance.
It was viewed as treason, essentially, which led to brutal military suppressions, mass enslavement, and exiles, like the Babylonian exile centuries earlier, and the massive Jewish diaspora under Rome.
The prejudice was a tool of imperial management.
Right. But as our timeline rolls forward, we hit a massive turning point. We move into late antiquity and the early Christian era, roughly spanning from 300 to 1000 CE, and the very nature of the prejudice completely transforms.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the exact moment where the prejudice transitions from being primarily political to being deeply ideological and moralized.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, you have Christianity emerging initially as a sect within Judaism, but over the first few centuries, it separates.
Right.
And as Christianity grows and eventually becomes the official dominant state religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, there is an intense competition for religious legitimacy.
Because both groups are reading from the same foundational texts, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Bible. But they're coming to radically different conclusions about the Messiah.
Exactly. So the early church has to explain to its followers and to the Romans why the original practitioners of this faith are rejecting the new Christian message.
And the narrative shifts profoundly here. It moves from the Roman idea of these people are politically rebellious to a new theological idea, these people are religiously and morally broken.
This is the birth of theological antisemitism. Jewish people were framed not just as having a different opinion, but as actively, maliciously rejecting the true faith.
And this is where we see the introduction of one of the most destructive narratives in human history, the deicide accusation.
The deicide accusation was the claim that Jewish people, collectively and for all subsequent generations, were entirely responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Which is wild when you look at the historical context.
It is, because historically, crucifixion was a Roman method of execution for political dissidents. But the theological narrative shifted the blame entirely onto the Jewish population.
Right.
This took an internal religious schism and reframed it as a profound cosmic moral betrayal.
And once you establish the narrative that a group of people killed God, well, the system layer is going to follow very quickly, right? You start seeing religious exclusion laws, bans on intermarriage, and decrees that Christians and Jews cannot eat together.
It laid the architectural groundwork for the next 1,000 years, which brings us into medieval Europe, spanning roughly from 1000 to 1500 CE.
The Middle Ages.
Yes. This is a very dark, incredibly complex era. We are dealing with rigid feudal societies, absolute authority wielded by the church, and massive catastrophic crises like the Black Death.
Right.
During this time, Ashkenazi Jews in Central and Eastern Europe were subjected to an entirely new level of systemic marginalization.
This is where we see the theological prejudice merge seamlessly with harsh economic realities. Let's look at how the system layer functioned here, because it is diabolical.
It really is.
In the feudal system, wealth and power were entirely tied to land, but Jews were legally barred from owning land.
Right, they couldn't be lords or farmers in the traditional sense.
Furthermore, the economy was heavily controlled by Christian artisan and merchant guilds, which were essentially religious fraternities, and Jews were explicitly barred from joining these guilds. So they can't farm and they can't be craftsmen.
So you have to ask what economic roles were actually legally available to them.
Not many.
They were actively pushed into the margins of the economy, particularly into commerce and money lending. And the reason for this was a very specific piece of Christian theology.
The usury laws.
Exactly. The church strictly forbade Christians from charging interest on loans to other Christians. It was considered the sin of usury.
But society still needed credit. I mean, you can't build massive stone cathedrals or fund the Crusades or establish global trade routes without taking out loans. The economy required liquid capital.
Exactly. The kings and the bishops needed a functioning credit system, but their own theology prevented them from running it.
Right.
So they forced the marginalized Jewish population into the role of moneylenders and tax collectors. It served the crown perfectly.
Oh, it was a brilliant, evil system for the ruling class.
The king could use Jewish moneylenders to extract wealth from the peasantry and the nobles, while deflecting all the anger and resentment onto the moneylenders themselves.
It's like being forced into a rigged game of poker. The dealer legally restricts your hand, you're only allowed to play with certain cards, and you're forced to play on behalf of the house.
Yes.
And then when you manage to win a single chip just to survive, the entire crowd surrounds the table and threatens your life for being greedy. It completely ignores the rules they forced you to play by in the first place.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the structural trap. It is the ultimate false cause and effect.
Yeah.
The society creates a highly specific, very dangerous economic role, forces a minority to fill it under threat of starvation, and then morally condemns the group for filling it.
It's just so hypocritical.
The narrative framed Jewish people as inherently greedy, entirely erasing the labyrinth of legal restrictions that forced them into those positions. And then, the ultimate material trigger hits Europe in the mid-14th century, the Black Death.
We really need to pause and understand the sheer terror of the Black Death. We are talking about the bubonic plague. Between 1347 and 1351, it wipes out anywhere from a third to half of the entire population of Europe.
It is mass death on a scale we cannot fathom today.
And there's absolutely zero scientific understanding of germ theory. They don't know about the bacteria, Yersinia pestis. They don't know about fleas on rats.
Nothing. The population is paralyzed by an apocalyptic level of terror. People are dying in agony within days, bleeding from their lymph nodes. Society is collapsing.
Right.
And human psychology simply cannot accept that level of suffering without an explanation. They cannot accept that it is just random, invisible nature. They demand a villain.
And because the Jewish population was already legally separated, already forced into the role of the economic villain, they were the easiest target. The pre-existing social discomfort and religious prejudice are instantly weaponized and converted into mythic, actionable stories.
This is when you see the explosion of the well poisoning myth.
This one is crazy.
The narrative claimed that an international conspiracy of Jews was actively poisoning the wells of Europe to destroy Christendom.
Which makes no sense since they were drinking from the same wells.
Logic completely leaves the room during a panic. This also tied into the blood libel, the horrific, entirely fabricated accusation that Jews were kidnapping and ritually murdering Christian children to use their blood in religious ceremonies.
Just incredibly dark stuff.
These myths provided a simple, comprehensible, and completely false explanation for incredibly complex, terrifying suffering.
But here is where the diagnostic manual flashes red. Because if you look closely at who actually benefited from the resulting mob violence and massacres, it wasn't just mindless peasant rage.
No, not at all.
The elites used this violently to their advantage. Rulers and nobles owed massive debts to Jewish moneylenders. So how do you balance the royal budget?
You whip up a mob.
Exactly. You whip up a mob, or you issue a royal decree excelling the entire Jewish community like they did from England in 1290, or from France, or later from Spain. The Jews are expelled or murdered, and suddenly the king's massive debts are completely erased.
The prejudice was highly functional. It served a dual purpose. It temporarily stabilized a terrified peasant society by giving them a scapegoat, and it financially rewarded the elites by liquidating their debt and allowing them to seize the property left behind.
Okay, so we've seen prejudice operate as a political tool in Rome, a theological weapon in the early church, and an economic pressure release valve in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Let's move the timeline forward because the historical record offers this fascinating, contrasting look at how different parts of the world trying to solve the perceived problem of the outsider. I want to look at the parallel Islamic empires and then contrast them with early modern Spain.
It is a vital comparison. Let's look at the Islamic empires first, roughly spanning from 700 to 1800 CE.
Okay.
We're looking at Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities living under vast states like the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasids, and later the Ottoman Empire.
Right, massive territories.
Huge. The context here is administrative governance on a massive scale. These were rapidly expanding Islamic states that conquered territories filled with millions of highly diverse non-Muslim populations.
Yeah.
They had to figure out how to govern them without inciting constant rebellion.
And their solution was a highly codified theological and legal hierarchy?
Yes. Under Islamic law, Jewish people, along with Christians, were designated as al-Kitab, or people of the book. Because they were monotheists with a revealed scripture, they were granted dhimmi status.
Yeah, I want to push back on that term slightly because sometimes I hear dhimmi status described almost like a multicultural utopia, but it fundamentally meant legal inequality, right? Isn't managed minority just an administrative way of saying second-class citizen?
That is a very important distinction to make. It was not a modern democracy, and it was absolutely a system of structural inequality. Dhimmis were required to pay a special, often heavy poll tax called the jizya. They faced various legal restrictions. Sometimes they couldn't build new places of worship. Their testimony in court might be valued less than a Muslim's, and they were generally barred from carrying weapons.
So they were structurally disadvantaged.
Very much so. However, the primary goal of the dhimmi system was managed stability and revenue collection, not mass scapegoating, forced conversion, or extermination.
That's a huge difference from medieval Europe.
Massive. The state provided protection and allowed Jewish communities a significant degree of self-governance regarding their own internal civil and religious laws.
So it was a deeply pragmatic system.
Highly pragmatic. And because of that pragmatism, there were long periods of profound cultural and economic flourishing.
Right.
Look at the Golden Age in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, where Jewish scholars, poets, and doctors rose to the highest levels of the royal courts.
Like Maimonides, right?
Exactly. Now, there were absolutely periods of severe persecution and violence under more radical dynasties like the Almohads, but generally speaking, the prejudice was structural. It was baked into the law to maintain a clear religious hierarchy. But the Jewish group was viewed as a subordinate minority to be managed, rather than a demonic existential threat to be eradicated.
Now, contrast that pragmatic management with what happens a few centuries later in early modern Spain, particularly between 1492 and the 1800s, the era of the Spanish Inquisition.
Right. This represents a completely different philosophy of state building.
Yeah.
By the late 15th century, the Spanish monarchy Ferdinand and Isabella had just completed the Reconquista, driving the last Islamic rulers out of the Iberian Peninsula.
Right, they had just fought this massive war.
They are trying to consolidate a massive, fractured territory into a single, unified nation-state. And in their minds, absolute political stability required absolute religious uniformity.
Right. They decide that you cannot be a true Spaniard unless you are a Catholic. So in 1492, they issue the Alhambra Decree. They essentially tell the entire Jewish population of Spain, which was one of the largest and most vibrant in the world, convert to Christianity, leave the country with nothing, or be killed.
A brutal ultimatum.
Yeah. Tens of thousands are forced to convert. These forced converts become known as conversos. But here's where it gets really interesting and where the diagnostic manual flashes red again. They forcefully coerce people to convert. But then the society completely refuses to trust the validity of the conversion.
Right. They demand assimilation but punish it at the same time.
It creates a total psychological and legal paradox. If you stay separate and practice Judaism, you are expelled or killed. If you assimilate and become a converso, you are treated as a subversive infiltrator. How is a human being supposed to survive a system like that?
The tragic reality is that many of them didn't. This specific dynamic is the birthplace of modern identity paranoia. The Spanish Inquisition, contrary to popular belief, was not primarily established to investigate practicing Jews or Muslims. They had already been officially expelled or converted.
Wait, really?
Yes, the Inquisition was established to investigate the conversos. They were hunting for crypto-Jews, people who had publicly converted but were suspected of secretly maintaining their old faith behind closed doors.
So they're looking for people who don't eat pork, or who change their linens on a Friday, or who don't have smoke coming from their chimney on the Sabbath.
Exactly. And this is where the justification layer undergoes a truly terrifying evolution. Because religion alone was no longer enough to identify the outsider, the system had to invent a new metric.
Oh, no.
We see the emergence of early proto-racial thinking. The Spanish developed the concept of limpieza de sangre, which translates to blood purity.
Wait, so it is no longer about what you actually believe in your heart or what church you attend?
No. The logic mutated entirely. The logic became, even if you converted, even if you go to Mass every Sunday, your blood is tainted by your ancestors. You are inherently deceptive.
That is chilling.
It shifted the prejudice from belief to biology. And this creates a state of unfalsifiable suspicion. Identity becomes a genetic trap that you cannot escape, no matter what your personal beliefs or actions are.
When a state demands that level of absolute ideological purity, suspicion itself becomes the primary social currency.
Exactly. The Inquisition weaponized the entire society against itself. Neighbors reported on neighbors, sometimes just to settle old petty disputes or to prove their own fanatical loyalty to the crown.
It's like the Salem witch trials on a national scale.
Worse, because it was institutionalized for centuries.
Yeah.
If you were accused, you often weren't allowed to know who accused you or what the specific evidence was. You were tortured until you confessed to a secret identity you might not even hold. The fear of internal betrayal became the organizing principle of Spanish society.
It's an entire nation turned into a panopticon. It's a communal witch hunt where the rules are explicitly designed so that you can never actually prove your innocence.
Right.
And that chilling shift moving the target from what you believe to who you inherently are by blood, that sets a devastating precedent for the rest of history.
It absolutely does.
Which brings us to the next major shift on our timeline. Because as Europe crawls out of the Middle Ages, goes through the Enlightenment, and secularizes in the 19th and 20th centuries, the old religious justifications simply stop working.
They don't carry the same weight anymore.
Right. An educated industrial society isn't going to execute people over a debate about medieval theology.
Exactly. In a post-Enlightenment world that idolizes reason, industry, and early science, prejudice couldn't rely solely on papal decrees to sound respectable. It needed a new disguise, modern objective disguise.
It's like a virus mutating to bypass a vaccine. When society stopped buying the religious justifications, when the Enlightenment made heresy an outdated concept, the prejudice just rebranded.
Yes.
It swapped the priest's robes for a lab coat. It started using the language of biology, genetics, and social Darwinism to sound respectable to a modern ear. It is terrifyingly adaptable.
To understand this modern mutation, we have to look at the massive material triggers of the 19th and early 20th century.
Right.
Europe was experiencing the whiplash of the Industrial Revolution.
Right, massive change.
Millions of people were moving from rural farms into crowded, dirty, rapidly changing cities.
Yeah.
At the same time, you had the rise of romantic nationalism, which obsessed over a single dangerous question. Who truly belongs to the soul of our nation?
Right, drawing strict boundaries around identity.
And crucially, overlapping with all of this was Jewish emancipation. Following the French Revolution and throughout the 19th century, Jewish people across Western and Central Europe were finally granted equal civil rights.
A huge moment of progress.
Yes, they were legally allowed to leave the ghettos, enter universities, become doctors, journalists, politicians, and integrated business owners.
So they suddenly become highly visible, successful participants in society during a time when the average citizen is experiencing extreme economic anxiety and social chaos.
And the narrative adapted instantly to this new reality. The prejudice shifted from religious antisemitism to racial and pseudoscientific antisemitism. Because Jewish people were successfully integrating, the new narrative framed them not as religious outsiders, but as a parasitic race infiltrating the pure national body.
Wow.
This is the era where modern conspiracy theories absolutely explode. We see the fabrication of documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Ah, right. We've talked about that before in other contexts.
Yes, it was a proven forgery created by the Russian secret police that claimed to be the minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders plotting global domination.
But why did a forgery like that gain so much traction? I mean, if it was fake, why did people believe it?
Because society was changing so fast,
Right.
and people felt so utterly out of control of their own lives. The factory had replaced the farm. International finance felt like dark magic to the average person.
Right.
The narrative that a secret, globally coordinated group was pulling all the strings provided a very simple, psychologically comforting explanation for the dizzying chaos of modern capitalism and political revolution.
So it's easier to believe in a villain than in chaos.
Exactly. If there's a secret cabal in charge, then the world isn't random. It is controlled. And if it's controlled, you can fight it by destroying the controllers.
Which leads us directly into the darkest manifestation of this machinery, the Nazi era, spanning from 1933 to 1945. When we look at the history, this era represents the most extreme, terrifying convergence of state propaganda, pseudoscientific justification, and cold bureaucratic control.
We have to place this in its immediate historical context, too. Germany in the 1920s and early 30s is a profoundly traumatized nation.
Post-World War I.
Right. They suffered a humiliating defeat in World War I, which birthed the stab-in-the-back myth, the false claim that the German army didn't lose on the battlefield, but was betrayed at home by Jews and socialists.
Deflecting blame again.
Always. Then you had the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, where money became so worthless people used it as wallpaper. And then the Great Depression hits.
Right.
The Nazi Party did not invent anti-Semitism, but they recognized it as a potent pre-existing energy source, and they weaponized it as the absolute core of their political platform. They took the 19th century racial theories and turned Jewish people into an existential biological threat to the very survival of the Aryan race.
And when you look at the system layer in Nazi Germany, seeing the sequence laid out step by step is deeply chilling because it was so methodical. It didn't start with extermination camps.
No, it was a highly mechanized, legally structured, gradual process.
Yeah.
First came massive state-sponsored propaganda to dehumanize the target.
Right.
Then came legal exclusion, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which literally defined who was Jewish based on their grandparents' bloodlines, stripping them of German citizenship and forbidding intermarriage.
And then the segregation.
Then came social segregation, banning Jews from public parks, schools, and theaters. Then came forced economic dispossession, the Aryanization of Jewish businesses, where the state legally forced Jews to sell their property to non-Jews for pennies.
Just daylight robbery endorsed by the state.
Exactly. Then came forced ghettoization, cramming hundreds of thousands of people into walled city districts with starvation rations. Then came the mass deportations on trains. And finally, the implementation of industrialized genocide, the Holocaust, resulting in the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children.
The justification layer here reached its absolute terrifying endpoint. The core claim of Nazi ideology was elimination is necessary for our survival. It was total biological dehumanization.
The complete inversion of morality.
Yeah. We watched the machinery evolve from you believe the wrong thing to you are hiding your true identity to finally your very biological existence is a lethal virus that must be eradicated.
And looking at that horrific progression raises perhaps the most important question of this entire deep dive. How did so many ordinary people go along with this? How did these massive systemic machines of prejudice actually operate on the ground, day to day, in the hands of regular citizens?
I'm so glad you brought that up because it is incredibly easy, sitting here in the comfort of today, to look at these grand historical movements and flatten them into a comic book narrative of just good guys versus bad guys.
Right. It's never that simple.
We need to look at the human element.
Yeah.
We need to look at the people who actually stamped the papers, drove the trains, and operated these systems.
If you look at the research regarding how populations behave under totalitarian systems or widespread systemic prejudice, the actors generally fall into 5 distinct categories.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have the true believers. These are the ideological architects, the religious zealots of the Inquisition, the racial theorists of the 19th century, the top echelon of the Nazi Party. They are driven by a deep, fanatical ideological conviction that what they are doing is morally righteous and necessary for the salvation of their world.
But they are usually a minority, right? I mean, the system requires a second group, the opportunists.
Precisely. The opportunists are the engines of the system. These are the medieval kings who expelled Jews to cancel their own massive debts.
Right.
They are the local bureaucrats who see enforcing the new segregation laws as a way to get a promotion. They are the rival business owners who happily take over a confiscated storefront, or the neighbor who reports a family just so they can loot their apartment.
Wow. So they don't even have to believe the ideology.
They might not believe it at all, but they exploit the systems to gain wealth, power, or social status.
Then you have the third group, the fearful followers. These are people who conform purely to avoid risk. They see the violence of the state, they feel the terrifying social pressure of the mob, and they participate simply because they are terrified of becoming the next target.
Fourth are the social conformists. This is a subtle but massive group. They go along with the system simply because the prejudice has become the accepted norm of their society.
They just want to fit in.
They desire belonging. They don't want to rock the boat. They absorb the vocabulary and the jokes of their environment and repeat them without deep thought.
And finally, you have the passive bystanders. They don't actively participate in the violence. They don't loot the apartments, but they enable the entire system to function smoothly through their silence and their averted eyes.
Which brings us to a vital concept, the constraint layer. We have to ask, why didn't more people resist? Why didn't more people stand up to the opportunists and the true believers?
We all like to think of ourselves as the hero of the movie. We all think, if I were in 1930s Germany, I would have been Oskar Schindler. I would have hidden people. I would have spoken out.
Everyone wants to believe that.
But statistically, we wouldn't have. We would have been the person nervously looking out the window and quietly closing the blinds. And it's not just because people are inherently cowardly. The historical record shows that these systems were explicitly engineered to make resistance almost impossible.
Exactly. The cost of dissent was astronomical. In medieval Europe, speaking out against the persecution of Jews meant you risked being labeled a heretic by the church, which resulted in total social exclusion or being burned at the stake.
A huge deterrent.
During the Spanish Inquisition, defending a converso meant you would immediately be investigated as a secret converso yourself. In Nazi Germany, active resistance meant the Gestapo would arrest you, torture you, and execute your entire family.
But it's not just the physical threat either, right? It's the information landscape.
Yes. Beyond the threat of physical death, there was the profound reality of total information control. It wasn't just that people were too terrified to act on the truth. The propaganda was so thick and the information control so absolute that they couldn't even figure out what the truth was in the first place.
Right.
In the Middle Ages, there was no scientific framework you could reference to disprove the rumors of well poisoning. In the 20th century, state-controlled radio and newspapers saturated the environment with lies from morning until night.
It's easy to look back and think, I would have stood up to the mob. But you're saying these systems were designed to make resistance not just dangerous, but epistemically difficult. You literally couldn't see the truth through the propaganda.
This raises an important question about human nature. Most people didn't wake up one morning deciding to become part of a horrific world historical crime. They adapted, step by tiny step, inside carefully designed systems that made those small actions feel normal, legally necessary, or practically unavoidable. The structure of this society allowed the true believers to lead, the opportunists to get rich, the conformists to comply, and the massive majority of bystanders to passively enable it all.
Okay, that is incredibly heavy. But to truly diagnose this, we need to go even deeper into the psychological basement. Having seen how this machinery is built and who operates it, we have to ask why.
The core motivation.
Yeah. Why does this specific target, the Jewish people, persist as the scapegoat across millennia? What deeply uncomfortable truths is a society desperately trying to avoid by hyper-focusing on this one group?
If you dig into the sociology and the psychology of this, it becomes clear that Jewish people functioned historically as a massive projection surface for a society's deepest, most unmanageable fears.
Like a blank screen they project their nightmares onto.
Precisely. Think back to the historical triggers we've discussed. Plagues represent the terrifying reality of invisible, random biological danger. Massive economic shifts, like the transition to capitalism or the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, represent a terrifying lack of control over one's own livelihood. Shifting national borders and rapid modernism create profound boundary anxiety.
It is that primal psychological need for a cohesive explanation. When a society is suffering, it is deeply unsatisfying and frightening to say, the global economy is incredibly complex, the supply chain broke down, and our leaders made poor fiscal policy decisions.
Other people don't want to hear that.
Or disease is a random mutation of nature and we simply don't have the medical technology to stop it. It is so much easier and so much more comforting for a panicked society to point a single finger and say, the world makes sense and it is terrible because of them.
It radically reduces complexity and instantly increases psychological comfort. And because Jewish communities historically maintained a distinct religious and cultural identity and didn't fully assimilate,
sometimes by their own choice to preserve their ancient heritage, but very often due to strict legal restrictions forcing them into ghettos, they became the ultimate, highly visible symbol of the outsider onto which any fear could be projected.
And this projection leads directly to one of the most fascinating and bizarre aspects of anti-Semitic narratives. The double bind.
Yes.
The absolute contradiction at the heart of the prejudice.
Right.
If you look at the propaganda, Jewish people are almost always framed simultaneously as incredibly weak, subhuman, and diseased, but also incredibly powerful, omniscient, and capable of controlling the globe.
That glaring contradiction is the clearest possible proof that the narrative is a psychological projection, not a reality-based assessment. Anti-Semitic narratives historically portrayed Jewish people as being responsible for both sides of a major conflict at the exact same time.
Like, how does that even work? Well, during the 20th century, they were accused by the far right of orchestrating a global communist revolution to destroy nations, while simultaneously being accused by the far left of orchestrating predatory international crony capitalism to enslave the worker.
Wait, I need to stop you there because that makes absolutely zero logical sense. How can a single group be the mastermind behind both communism and ultra-capitalism?
It doesn't have to make logical sense. That is the point.
Wow.
The narrative isn't an evidence-based description of reality. It is a shape-shifting container for whatever anxiety the dominant culture is feeling at that exact moment. If the culture fears communism, the Jew is the communist. If the culture fears capitalism, the Jew is the greedy banker.
There's another really thorny mechanism we need to unpack here. The weaponization of extremism. How do historical conflicts or the actions of a few individuals get used as ammunition for prejudice? Because prejudice often tries to justify itself by pointing to real events.
This requires very careful intellectual distinction. Real conflicts, extremism, or the isolated bad actions of individuals belonging to a minority group do not create widespread systemic prejudice.
Right.
However, human beings are incredibly flawed, pattern-seeking creatures. We heavily overweight vivid examples and highly emotional events.
I think of it like this. Imagine a person decides to put on a pair of deeply red-tinted glasses. They walk into a massive, incredibly diverse stadium crowd of 50,000 people.
Okay.
They scan the crowd, they spot the one single individual who happens to be wearing a bright red shirt, and they point and yell, "See, I told you, look at the evidence, everyone here is red." It is confirmation bias on absolute steroids.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Systems of prejudice operate by purposefully selecting, framing, and artificially amplifying small, isolated data points to confirm their pre-existing biases. One extreme example, combined with an existing hateful narrative, is suddenly treated by the propagandists as absolute proof of the entire global group's inherent nature. It takes a tiny sample size and generalizes it across an incredibly diverse, worldwide population.
So they use the exception to prove their fake rule.
And again, the function of this is deflection. Blaming a visible minority group allows a society to avoid confronting deeply ingrained systemic inequality, the massive failures of its own elite leadership class, or the terrifying randomness of the natural world.
Yeah.
Prejudice is a functional tool. It temporarily stabilizes a panicked society by providing a very simple, very false explanation for complex human suffering.
So if that is how this massive ancient machinery is built and operated, how on earth do we actually dismantle it? That brings us to the final phase of our deep dive, deconstructing the construct.
This is the practical application.
To completely break down this historical machinery, we have to aggressively contrast the manufactured, simplified stereotypes of the narrative layer with the actual, incredibly complex, lived reality of the Jewish diaspora today.
The most foundational structural myth that has to be debunked is the monolith myth. The underlying assumption of almost all prejudice is that the marginalized group is one uniform, monolithic culture with a single mind, a single goal, and a single belief system.
Which couldn't be further from the truth.
The reality of the Jewish people is that they are one of the most incredibly diverse populations on the planet.
Right. If you look at ethnic backgrounds alone, it is vastly diverse. You have Ashkenazi Jews, whose ancestors trace back to Central and Eastern Europe, who historically spoke Yiddish.
Right.
You have Sephardic Jews, tracing their roots back to the Iberian Peninsula before the Inquisition, historically speaking Ladino. You have Mizrahi Jews, whose communities have existed continuously in the Middle East and North Africa for millennia. And you have vibrant communities of Ethiopian Jews, Indian Jews, and diverse communities across the Americas. It's not a monolith.
And religiously, the spectrum is just as wide. You have ultra-Orthodox communities living very traditional, insulated lives. You have conservative and reform movements that integrate deeply into modern secular society while maintaining religious practice.
All right.
And you have millions of people whose Jewish identity is entirely secular, cultural, or historical, who might identify as agnostic or atheist. There is no single Jewish experience. They debate and disagree on theology, politics, and culture constantly.
And there are the persistent, incredibly stubborn myths regarding money, power, and coordinated conspiracy. The stereotype of inherent wealth and global financial control completely ignores the demographic reality that most Jewish people historically, and millions today, are working class or middle class, and many live in poverty. As we discuss with the medieval guilds, the historical visibility of Jewish people in finance was the direct result of brutal, forced economic restrictions, not some grand, inherent master plan for control. Visibility bias created the narrative.
And the conspiracy myth, the idea of a secret, unified global influence over world governments, media, or banking, is perhaps the most persistent and dangerous myth of all.
It just won't die.
No, it won't. Because it relies entirely on that fearful, pattern-seeking anxiety we discussed. When modern people don't understand how algorithms, global markets, or geopolitics work, they fall back on the oldest narrative available.
Which is why it's so vital to look closely at modern Jewish organizations, because they are often the target of these conspiracy theories. The stereotype suggests a unified hierarchical structure controlling things from behind the scenes.
The shadow government.
Exactly. But when you actually look at the institutional reality, it is a completely decentralized, chaotic network of organizations that have wildly different and very often conflicting goals.
Let's map a few of those out to show the diversity. You have major religious and communal organizations like the Orthodox Union or the Union for Reform Judaism, whose primary focus is supporting spiritual life, kosher certification, and religious education.
Right.
Then you have massive civil rights and advocacy groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, whose mission is monitoring hate groups, extremism, and fighting anti-Semitism and bias broadly in society.
And then you have massive humanitarian groups, like the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or HIS. These organizations are out there doing global disaster relief, providing social services, and resettling refugees.
Yes.
And crucially, a massive amount of their humanitarian work goes to helping non-Jewish populations globally who are suffering from war or natural disasters.
You also have Israel-related advocacy organizations like AIPAC, which focus specifically on the political relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And it is vital to note that these political lobbying groups do not represent the political views of all Jewish people. The diaspora holds incredibly diverse, often fiercely opposed political views regarding Israeli policy and Middle Eastern geopolitics.
It's heavily debated internally.
Absolutely. Finally, you have vast cultural and memory institutions like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem or the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., dedicated to historical preservation, education, and memory.
So when you actually look at the reality, it is a sprawling network, not a monolith. They are highly decentralized. They actively argue with each other in the press. They compete for funding. They have entirely different daily priorities.
Exactly. The appearance of coordination that conspiracy theorists point to is simply the natural result of a group having a shared historical identity, overlapping concerns about rising prejudice, and high visibility in certain professional sectors due to a cultural emphasis on education.
So it's shared identity. It is emphatically not centralized control.
Precisely.
So as we pull all these threads together, what does this actually mean for you today? When you are scrolling through your social media feeds or watching a cable news broadcast and you see coded language.
Right.
When you see a commentator just asking questions about who really controls the central banks or who is really funding a particular media narrative or who is secretly orchestrating immigration patterns, what are you actually looking at?
If we imagine our visual backdrop shifting one last time, away from the historical timeline and transforming into a vibrant, glowing, multinodal network representing modern digital communication, the takeaway becomes painfully clear.
What are we seeing?
When you see those coded questions online, you're watching the exact same ancient machinery boot up.
Wow.
The modern era is defined by unprecedented information overload, rapid technological shifts, and intense geopolitical instability. We are living in a moment of massive societal stress.
And we know what stress does.
Yes. And that stress reliably triggers the rapid spread of simplified, highly emotional blame narratives. The aesthetic language might be totally modern. It's internet memes, it's algorithmic amplification, it's slick political podcast rhetoric. But the underlying mechanical structure is ancient.
It is the blueprint of bias operating right in front of us. So let's synthesize this profound journey we've been on. We started by looking for a diagnosis. And we have seen that historical prejudice is not just a fleeting emotion or a personal failing. It is a highly adaptable, multi-generational machine.
It's an architecture.
Yeah, an architecture. It is constructed out of narratives that assign false blame. It is locked into physical reality by systems that enforce separation and inequality. And it is excused and perpetuated by justifications that make the cruelty feel perfectly acceptable to the average, everyday citizen.
Right.
Jewish history serves as a profound, albeit deeply tragic, mirror for humanity. It shows us exactly what happens when the human desire for absolute certainty and control goes unchecked, and when incredibly complex societal problems are projected onto a visible minority.
And this brings us back to the core mission of this deep dive. Why spend an hour dissecting this darkness? Because understanding these structural mechanisms is the only viable way to interrupt them.
Yes.
When you thoroughly understand the blueprint of bias, you can actually see the system operating in real time.
You can see the code.
You can. You can recognize when a society under intense economic or political stress is attempting to simplify its terrifying problems by pointing an angry finger at an outsider. You can spot the true believers driving the ideology. You can identify the opportunists exploiting the chaos for their own gain. And most importantly, you can recognize the dangerous passive conformity of the bystanders.
We started this hour talking about a broken medical X-ray machine, how in the messy world of sociology and historical trauma, things aren't as clean as a fractured bone. But maybe, by examining this history so closely, we've actually built a new kind of scanner.
I like that.
One that allows us to see past the surface noise, past the politics of the day, and look directly at the skeletal structure of prejudice itself.
We can clearly see the fractures in the logic.
Yeah.
We can identify the disease narratives before they spread. And we can recognize the systems of incentive that sustain them.
Exactly. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you step away from this and back into your day.
Okay.
We've seen how the machinery of prejudice constantly evolves to survive. We've seen that the justification layer always, without fail, adopts the most respected, unquestioned language of its specific era to disguise its hatred.
That's the pattern.
It used the absolute language of theology and divine will when the church ruled the world. It used the language of biology, genetics, and pseudoscience when the Industrial Revolution made science the new god.
Right.
So I want you to look around at the world today. What is the most respected, unquestioned language in our society right now? Is it the invisible mathematical language of data and algorithms? Is it the urgent language of national security and border protection? Is it the moral language of social justice? Or the pragmatic language of economic fairness? Whatever it is, how might that exact, highly respected language be quietly weaponized tomorrow to justify the exact same ancient fears?